This is the Strides to Solutions podcast, and I am your host, Esther Adams. Today, we are going to sit with something almost everyone lives with and almost no one examines closely, which is the voice inside your own head. Not the voice that reminds you to buy milk, but the one that judges you, the running inner commentary that decides moment to moment whether you are doing well enough. We are going to look at where that voice comes from, why some people's inner narrator sounds like a fair witness while others sounds like a prosecutor, what it does to the brain and even to the body over time, and most usefully, what the research says actually changes it. So let me begin where the science does, with a puzzle. Most of us carry a running commentary. It narrates the ordinary parts of the day, second guesses the message we just sent, replays a conversation we wish had gone differently, and offers verdicts about our worth that we would never say out loud to a friend. We tend to treat this voice as a fixed feature of who we are, something closer to eye color than to a habit. Some people assume it is the unavoidable price of being self aware. Others assume it is simply a defect they were handed and now have to silence. Both of those assumptions turn out to be a little off, and the way they are off is the reason this episode exists. Here is the puzzle that opens the science. When researchers look at what the brain is doing during quiet, thoughtful self reflection, the kind that helps you make sense of your life, and then look at what the brain is doing during harsh, looping self criticism, the kind that keeps you awake rehearsing your failures, they do not find two different machines. They find the same machine running in two different modes. The regions that let you reflect wisely on who you are, to a striking degree, the same regions that produce the voice tearing you apart. So the honest question is not whether you have an inner critic. Nearly everyone does. The question is what determines which mode that shared machinery settles into, and whether that setting can be changed. That is what the research can now begin to answer, and the answer moves through the brain, through your earliest relationships, through the culture you inherited, into your body, and finally into the specific things that have been shown to shift the voice. Let me start with the machine itself because understanding it changes how you interpret everything that follows. Neuroscientists have spent the last 2 decades studying a set of brain regions that tend to activate together whenever we are not focused on the outside world. It is called the default mode network, and it earns that name because it comes online by default, in the pauses, when attention turns inward. 3 areas anchor it. There is the medial prefrontal cortex, sitting behind the forehead, which is especially busy during evaluative thinking about yourself, the kind where you are weighing who you are against some standard. There is the posterior cingulate cortex, further back and toward the center of the brain, which appears to act as a hub, gathering and broadcasting the pieces of your personal narrative. And there is a region in the parietal lobe that helps pull up personally relevant memories and imagine how you look through someone else's eyes. Together, these areas weave memory, language, and emotion into something that feels like a continuous story of you. That storytelling function is not a malfunction. It is arguably one of the most sophisticated things the human brain does. The trouble is that the same network that authors a coherent, meaningful self narrative can also get stuck authoring a punishing one. Researchers who study this distinction have landed on a subtle but important conclusion. Adaptive self reflection and maladaptive self criticism are not cleanly separated by which nodes light up. They are separated more by how those nodes interact with each other and by whether they stay connected to 2 other systems in the brain. One is the executive control network, the frontoparietal system that lets you direct attention on purpose. The other is the salience network, which flags what matters and helps you switch between looking inward and looking outward. When the default mode network is flexibly coupled to those control and salience systems, self-focus tends to stay useful. You can think about a mistake, learn something from it, and then move your attention elsewhere when the thinking is done. When that coupling weakens, something different happens. Studies of rumination, which is the clinical term for repetitive, brooding, negative thought, describe a kind of internal lock in. The self referential loops become harder to interrupt. In people prone to depression, one line of research describes reduced inhibition flowing from the salience network into the default mode network, so that the internal negative model stops getting updated by what is actually happening in the outside world. In everyday terms, the mind keeps rehearsing the same verdict and cannot get a signal through that says, "This is enough, look up now." Some of this work is correlational and some of it is drawn from specific clinical populations, so it should be held as a strong emerging picture rather than a closed case. But the shape of it is consistent. The critical voice is less a special structure and more a particular pattern of connection, one where inward focus loses its off switch. That distinction matters for a reason that goes beyond neuroscience trivia. If the inner critic were a separate broken part, the goal would be to remove it. But if it is a mode of a healthy essential network, then the realistic goal is not deletion, it is regulation. It is restoring the flexibility that lets you reflect without getting trapped. Keep that in mind because almost everything that has been shown to help works by improving that flexibility rather than by silencing the voice outright. So, where does the content of the voice come from in the first place? Why does one person's inner narrator sound like a fair witness and another person sound like a prosecutor? The strongest developmental evidence points backward to the earliest relationships and to something attachment researchers call internal working models. The idea is that when we are very young, the repeated experience of how caregivers respond to our distress lays down a set of expectations, mostly operating outside awareness, about two things. What can I expect from other people when I need them, and what does that imply about me? A child whose distress is met, more often than not, with reliable comfort, tends to build a model in which the self is worthy of care and others are available. A child whose distress is met with inconsistency, rejection, or approval that only arrives when they perform correctly tends to build a different model, one in which love feels contingent and the self feels not quite good enough as it is. A meta analysis pulling together many studies found that insecure attachment, and anxious attachment in particular, is robustly associated with higher self criticism. Anxious attachment shows a stronger link than avoidant attachment does, which fits the underlying logic. Anxious attachment is organized around the fear of not being enough to keep connection secure, and self criticism is, in a sense, that fear turned into an internal voice. One way researchers frame it is that self criticism functions as a self blaming coping style that develops in exactly those settings where distress was met with limited reassurance and conditional approval. The internalized message becomes a strategy. If I catch my flaws first and punish them hard enough, maybe I can earn the acceptance I am not sure is coming. You can see the whole chain in studies of depressed adults. Early adverse stress predicts anxious attachment, which predicts self criticism, which predicts difficulty regulating emotion, which predicts more severe depression. In adolescence, parent child conflict and criticism predict higher self criticism, and that self criticism in turn helps explain risk for self injury, as though the criticism a young person absorbed from outside becomes a form of self punishment they now deliver from inside. Neuroimaging adds a layer to this. When people engage in self criticism, their attachment style seems to shape how threatening that internal voice feels and how vividly they can bring supportive imagery to bear against it. Securely attached individuals appear better able to summon a soothing internal presence under threat, while avoidant individuals show a kind of defensive disengagement, less imagery, more distancing. The inner critic, in other words, is not just a set of harsh sentences. It is built on a scaffolding of expectations about whether anyone, including yourself, will show up for you when you are struggling. This is where the picture would be too simple if we stopped at individual psychology. because the voice does not form in a vacuum. It speaks a language and repeats stories it was given, and those come from culture and from family history. Research on intergenerational storytelling shows that the narratives handed down across generations can either build pride, continuity, and an integrated sense of identity, or, when they are steeped in internalized inferiority or told only through a deficit lens, can seed shame and a fragmented sense of self. For members of marginalized groups, being cut off from affirming histories or being exposed only to distorted accounts from a dominant culture has been linked to poorer mental health and to difficulty even imagining a future. In these cases, the harsh inner voice is not merely personal. It is partly a socially supplied script, carrying the weight of stories about worth and danger that were transmitted long before the individual could evaluate them. The comparison across cultures complicates the idea of the inner critic in a genuinely interesting way. We tend to assume, especially in Western settings, that self criticism is inherently corrosive. But cross cultural work suggests that culture shapes how self criticism is used, how intense it becomes, and crucially, whether it is experienced as harmful or as useful, rather than whether people have it at all. In one study using brain activity measures, American participants showed a self enhancing pattern, treating their successes as more defining than their failures. Taiwanese participants showed the reverse, with failures weighing relatively more heavily, a more self critical stance. Yet, in interviews, Chinese young adults describe something they thought of as benign self criticism, a deliberate focus on their shortcomings understood as a path towards self improvement and social harmony, not as an attack. In more collectivist settings, a certain amount of self critical focus can be culturally framed as self cultivation, which may buffer some of its emotional cost. A meta analysis found that self compassion protects against internalizing problems more strongly in individualistic cultures, partly because in collectivist cultures the self critical stance is more normalized as adaptive. That does not mean self criticism is harmless wherever it is culturally endorsed. In some collectivist contexts, intense self criticism tied to strict family expectations has been linked to social difficulties and aggression, and internalized stigma around not meeting social norms functions as its own kind of harsh, socially anchored inner critic. The point is subtler than good or bad. The same internal behavior, focusing critically on your own flaws, can carry a different meaning, a different intensity, and a different psychological cost, depending on the cultural story that surrounds it. Any honest account of the inner voice has to hold that complexity rather than flatten it into a single soundbite about self criticism being universally toxic. So far, we have a voice built by early relationships, scripted in part by culture, and running on a brain network that can get stuck in an inward loop. The next thing the research makes clear is that this is not only a mental event, it has a body attached to it, and the bill for chronic self critical rumination is paid in physiology. The most useful bridge here is a concept called perseverative cognition, which simply means repetitive thinking about a stressor that keeps going after the stressor itself is gone. The theory behind it is almost mechanical. A stressful event triggers a physiological stress response, and normally that response resolves once the event passes. But if you keep the event alive in your mind, rehearsing it, dreading its return, replaying your failures, you keep the physiological response switched on. The thought becomes the stressor. The body cannot tell the difference between the meeting that already happened and your mind rerunning it for the 40th time. It helps to understand why a thought can reach the body at all, because that link is easy to assert and rarely explained. A broad review frames the medial, prefrontal, and default mode systems, the same self referential machinery we met earlier, as constructing a model of the self in context, a running interpretation that assigns personal meaning to events, and in doing so, helps regulate not only behavior, but the body's peripheral physiology. In that framing, The self-narrating network is wired into the systems that set your heart rate, your blood pressure, and your hormonal tone. So when the narration turns into a threat, you keep rehearsing. The wiring carries that threat downward into the body. The thought is not a separate mental event floating above the physiology. It is part of the same regulatory loop, which is exactly why chronic self attack can leave a physical signature. When researchers measure what this does, the pattern is consistent. Perseverative cognition is associated with higher blood pressure, elevated levels of the stress hormone cortisol, and lower heart rate variability. That last measure deserves a translation because it does a lot of work in this field. Heart rate variability refers to the small natural variation in the time between one heartbeat and the next. A healthy heart is not a metronome. That variability reflects the flexibility of your autonomic nervous system, its capacity to shift smoothly between activation and calm. Higher variability generally signals a system that can regulate itself well. Lower variability tends to reflect a body stuck in a more defended, stress loaded state. In one laboratory study, people high in trait rumination showed poorer cardiovascular adaptation when they faced the same stressor twice, meaning their bodies did not settle down on the second exposure the way you would hope. The mind that will not let go keeps the body braced. The story extends into the immune system as well. A scoping review of human studies found that greater rumination is often associated with higher inflammatory markers, the molecular signals of low grade, body wide inflammation. This fits a broader body of work in psychoneuroimmunology, showing that chronic psychological stress can drive systemic inflammation and dysregulate immune function, with downstream links to a range of stress related diseases over time. Some of this evidence is correlational, and some of the strongest mechanistic detail comes from animal studies of chronic stress, so it should be described as a well supported pattern rather than a proven direct line from any one thought to any one illness. Still, the implication is sobering and clarifying at once. Chronic self attack is not just emotionally painful, it appears to keep the whole stress architecture activated in ways that, accumulated across years, can wear on the cardiovascular and immune systems. If that is the cost of the critical mode, the natural next question is whether its opposite carries a benefit, and here the research on self compassion becomes relevant. Self compassion, in the clinical sense, is not indulgence or letting yourself off the hook. It is the capacity to meet your own suffering and failure with the same warmth and understanding you would offer someone you care about. And across studies of stress physiology, higher trait self compassion is reliably linked to a more regulated profile, lower heart rate under stress, higher heart rate variability, steeper and healthier daily cortisol rhythms. Self criticism tends to show the opposite pattern. In adults with generalized anxiety, higher self compassion was associated with better autonomic regulation during a stressful task, and a self compassion intervention specifically reduced the heart rate response to a stressor in a way that a comparison mindfulness intervention did not. I want to be careful here, though, because this is a place where the science is often oversold. Most of these studies test the separate effects of self compassion and self criticism, or include them side by side in a model. Relatively few actually test whether self compassion statistically moderates the physiological damage of chronic self criticism, meaning whether it specifically buffers the harm rather than just running as a competing, healthier process. The evidence best supports the idea that self compassion counterbalances self criticism, enhancing the calming, restorative side of the nervous system, rather than the stronger claim that it has been proven to neutralize self criticism's effects. There is also a genuinely important caveat about dose and timing. In one study, a very brief self compassion training given to adolescents showed no clear benefit and possibly even some detrimental effects on stress recovery. Longer multi week compassion based programs in adults did improve heart rate variability and reduce reactivity. So the finding is not that a quick dose of self kindness fixes the body. It is that cultivating self compassion over time appears to support a healthier physiological pattern, while a superficial version may do little, or, in some developmental stages, briefly backfire. That brings us to the part everyone actually wants, which is what changes the voice. And the research here is both encouraging and refreshingly unwilling to promise magic. Let me move through the main approaches in the order that makes the mechanisms clearest, starting with the one with the broadest evidence base: cognitive reappraisal, which most people would recognize as reframing. Reappraisal means changing how you interpret a situation or a thought, altering its meaning rather than gritting your teeth against the feeling it produces. A large review of nearly 100 studies found that positive reappraisal buffers the impact of stress and functions as what the authors call a proximal resilience factor, a mechanism close to the action that links other strengths to better outcomes. A meta analysis of 64 samples involving around 30,000 people found a moderate positive association between reappraisal and personal resilience. Over a 20-year span, adults who used reappraisal more showed better later health and well being, and a good part of that advantage came from becoming less emotionally reactive to ordinary daily stressors. But reappraisal is not the same as positive thinking, and the research is unusually clear about the difference. Reframes that are unrealistic or superficial can feel fake and can even backfire. Reappraisal that is used to avoid a problem or that quietly feeds continued rumination has been linked to worse outcomes rather than better ones. The reframes that seem to generalize and support stable well being are the ones grounded in real experience, practiced over time, and connected to action, not deployed as a one off trick to paper over a genuine problem. So, reframing matters a great deal, and it also has to stay honest to be useful. That is an important distinction to carry forward. There is a related and slightly surprising tool that works through language rather than through content, and it is worth understanding because it reveals something about how the critical voice operates. Researchers distinguish between immersed self talk, where you narrate your experience in the first person using I, and distanced self talk, where you address yourself by name, or as you, or in the third person. That small linguistic shift creates psychological distance, and the effects are consistent enough to matter. Distanced reflection reliably reduces the emotional intensity of negative experiences with small to moderate effect sizes. Using less first person language when reflecting on a stressor is linked to lower stress, better emotional recovery, and less rumination in daily life. In studies of psychotherapy transcripts, greater linguistic distancing tracks with lower symptom levels and better treatment outcomes, which suggests it is a marker of a mind that is finding its footing. What makes this interesting, rather than gimmicky, is the mechanism. Speaking to yourself from a slight distance seems to loosen the fusion between you and the thought. Instead of being inside, I am failing, you get a small step back to, she is having a hard day, or you can handle this. Distance reflection has been shown to increase what researchers call wise reasoning, meaning intellectual humility and perspective taking. When people think through their difficult experiences, it even shifts decision making. Dropping the word I from how a choice is described led people to make more patient, future oriented decisions in one study. I will add one honest complication that keeps this from becoming a slogan. In another study, distanced self talk led participants to keep more money for themselves in a sharing game, which the researchers interpreted as enhanced rational self interest. So, distance is not automatically morally better. It is a tool for cooling emotional reactivity and widening perspective, and what counts as better depends on the situation you are applying it to. Now, a lot of popular advice frames the ideal as learning to step back and observe your thoughts without believing them, an approach that goes by names like decentering, disidentification, or metacognitive awareness. The instruction is essentially to see thoughts as passing mental events rather than as facts or as definitions of who you are. This is genuinely valuable, and it clearly helps some people, but I want to represent the evidence accurately because it is more mixed than the enthusiasm around it suggests. When researchers have compared these metacognitive, observe your thoughts approaches directly against more traditional cognitive approaches that dispute and restructure the content of thoughts, the metacognitive strategies have not been shown to be clearly superior for disengaging from maladaptive inner dialogue. In one daily life randomized trial, a detached mindfulness technique reduced repetitive negative thinking and negative affect, but so did an active control exercise, and the detached mindfulness showed no added benefit in the immediate term. Meanwhile, cognitive behavioral therapy focused on restructuring thought content produces moderate reductions in repetitive negative thinking, especially when the protocol specifically targets that repetitive thinking. The reasonable reading is not that one of these is right and the other wrong. They appear to work through different routes. Changing your relationship to a thought and changing the content of a thought are two different mechanisms, and the direct head to head evidence for which one better loosens your identification with the inner critic is honestly still thin. That uncertainty is not a failure of the science. It is the current state of the map, and knowing where the map is blank protects you from anyone selling a single technique as the answer. Where the evidence gets more robust is with self compassion and mindfulness based programs aimed directly at the harsh voice. A meta analysis of 20 randomized trials found that self compassion based interventions, including compassion focused therapy and compassionate mind training, produced a medium reduction in self criticism compared with control conditions, and longer programs worked better than shorter ones. Mindfulness based cognitive therapy reliably reduces rumination and increases both self compassion and decentering, with effects that hold up at follow up. And it appears especially helpful for people who start out with high rumination and low self compassion, which is to say, the people most gripped by an entrenched critical voice. The techniques that show up across these programs are concrete: soothing rhythm breathing, compassion imagery, writing yourself a compassionate letter, and structured dialogues where you actually address the inner critic as a separate voice rather than fusing with it. And there is real biology underneath this. Compassion based interventions have been shown to change brain function, connectivity, and neurophysiology, which is genuine evidence of neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to reorganize with training. Longitudinal imaging studies find that these programs tend to increase activity in prefrontal and reward related regions, and in some cases, strengthen the connections that support cognitive control during compassionate responding. Compassionate mind training has been shown to raise heart rate variability, that marker of a flexible, self regulating nervous system, and that physiological shift partly accounts for the increase in feelings of safeness and the reduction in self criticism and shame. In refugees who completed a mindfulness and compassion based trauma program, increases in self compassion and decreases in self criticism actually mediated the improvements in depression and post traumatic stress, meaning the change in the self relationship was part of the causal path to feeling better, not just a pleasant side effect. I have to add the honest boundary that the researchers themselves insist on, because it is the difference between science and marketing. While it is clear that these interventions reduce self criticism and produce measurable neural and physiological change, only a few studies have directly tied a specific neural change to the dismantling of chronically self critical thinking. The counteracting mechanism, the precise story of how the brain undoes an entrenched pattern of self attack, is still only partly mapped. So the accurate statement is that the plasticity is real and the behavioral benefit is real, and the fine grained neural pathway from here to there remains an open question. That is a more trustworthy claim than a confident promise of rewiring, and it is also, I think, more hopeful because it is actually supported. It is worth pausing on how these programs seem to work at the level of the brain, because it connects back to the machine we started with and closes a loop. Remember that the difference between useful reflection and stuck self criticism was not really about which regions activate. It was about flexibility, about whether the self referential network stays connected to your control and attention systems and can shift when it needs to. That is precisely what training appears to improve. One study found that mindfulness based therapy improved the efficiency with which people's brains reconfigure between a resting state and a focused task across the executive default mode and salience networks, which the researchers interpreted as the intrinsic wiring being nudged closer to a mindful configuration. Other work tracking brain states over time found that higher rumination corresponds to spending more time in states dominated by the default mode network, and that cognitive behavioral therapy reduces how often those default dominant states occur, while making it easier to shift into states led by the executive control network. There is even early evidence that the posterior cingulate cortex, that central hub of the self narrative, can be trained as a regulable node in people with early life adversity who tend to have more difficulty quieting that hub. A neurofeedback approach that helped them downregulate it was feasible and linked to improvements in mood and stress. None of this amounts to erasing the critic. What it describes is the off switch being repaired, the flexibility being restored, so that inward focus can end when its work is done. There is one more layer that pulls these threads together, and it may be the most important for making change last. Across a range of therapies, researchers keep finding that durable change in self talk depends on a changed underlying story about who you are. This is the domain of narrative identity. The observation is that inner speech does two jobs at once. It constructs your personal narrative, the ongoing account of your life and your place in it, and it enacts that narrative in the moment as positive or negative self talk, which means that lasting change in the voice is hard to achieve by editing individual sentences because the sentences are downstream of the story. If the underlying story is I am someone to whom bad things happen and it is probably my fault, then reframing one bad day will not hold because tomorrow the story generates a new critical sentence to match. The therapeutic work that seems to produce durable change targets the story itself. Moving from a fragmented or self blaming autobiographical narrative toward a more coherent, reality based account of yourself in relationship with others is described as a core mechanism of change in several conditions. In the treatment of borderline personality disorder, early reductions in problematic narrative markers predict later symptom gains, as though stabilizing how you tell your story helps hold the improvement in place. In post traumatic stress, long term outcomes are better when written trauma narratives contain more balanced beliefs and a more positive view of the self. A particularly clarifying technique used with young people who self harm is externalizing the problem, deliberately reframing the difficulty as something separate from the self, which weakens the fused link between I am the problem and reinforces a more capable inner voice. When people integrate a loss, an illness, or a trauma into a coherent life story, one that holds the pain honestly while also holding agency and continuity, the inner monologue tends to move from hopeless and self blaming toward something more compassionate, more realistic, and more oriented toward a future worth having. So let me return to the puzzle we started with now that we are better equipped to see it. The inner critic is not a separate broken part to be excised, and it is not a permanent fact of your character. It is a mode of a shared and essentially healthy system, the same self reflective machinery that lets you make meaning of your life. That mode was tuned early by relationships that taught you what to expect when you needed care and what that seemed to say about your worth. It was scripted in part by a culture that assigned particular meanings to focusing on your own flaws. It runs on a brain network that stays useful when it remains flexibly connected to your systems of control and attention, and turns punishing when that flexibility fails and the inward loop loses its off switch. And when it runs chronically in that critical mode, It keeps the body's stress system switched on in ways that, over years, appear to carry a real physiological cost. What changes it is not a single trick, and the evidence is honest about that. Realistic reappraisal helps, as long as it stays grounded and does not become avoidance. A small linguistic step back, addressing yourself with a little distance, cools the reactivity and widens the view. Learning to see thoughts as thoughts helps some people, though it has not been proven better than directly challenging their content, and the direct comparison is still unsettled. The most reliable, most replicated shifts come from cultivating self compassion and from mindfulness based approaches, which reduce self criticism and rumination, raise the flexibility of the nervous system, and produce measurable change in the brain, even if the exact pathway that dismantles an entrenched pattern is not yet fully charted. And underneath all of it, the change that seems to last is a change in the story, a slow reauthoring of who you take yourself to be so that the voice generating your daily sentences has something truer and kinder to work from. The desired result is not a mind without an inner voice. That would mean losing the very capacity for reflection that makes a human life examinable and meaningful. The result the science points toward is a mind that can reflect without getting trapped, that can notice a failure and learn from it and then look up, and that speaks to itself in the difficult moments, more like someone who is on your side. That voice was learned, which is the hard part and also the hopeful part, because what was learned in relationship, in culture, and in repetition can, with the right kind of sustained effort, be learned again differently. Thank you for spending this time with me. This has been Strides to Solutions, and I am Esther Adams.